There we go. So this entire conversation was really inspired by an amazing article that came out early last week. It was an article featuring Serene, who was pushing back against some bogus fees that their landlord was trying to charge them to renew their lease. And so instead of me trying to rehash the story, I wanted to throw it over to Serene to talk about her experiences and to talk about, what she learned and what we can all learn from her experiences.
Thank you so much for that. Like Jacob said, my name is Serene. I've been a renter in the area for, I want to say like 4 of the last 5 years. And most recently I've been living in Allston, used to live in Brighton. And the current apartment I'm living in, we were renewing it for the second time. And it's always kind of like a hectic process, like trying to make sure you get things signed, trying to make sure, no realtors are showing up at your door, trying to like show your space off. And so the first time we had done it, there was no problem. We didn't have to pay a fee. We just re-signed the lease and then went about our business. The second time around, we got a notice from a realtor who works with our landlord that had an agreement to have this realtor send out the leases instead of having my landlord do it. But they were charging us for that service, which I felt was kind of weird. And I saw a comment actually in the Allston-Brighton Facebook group that prompted me to reach out to the Attorney General, which I was able to do online. I didn't have to like call anyone. I didn't have to do anything crazy. Just filled out a form online, let them know, and they reached out to me. I believe they called me, and we also communicated over email. And they wanted to get my side of the story, figure out what was going on. And they then reached out to this person who had charged me the fee, which was $100, which I thankfully could pay for. And for some people isn't that much money, but it's the principle of the thing for me. And so I reached out to the AG. Essentially, they told me that this wasn't a fee I had to pay, and that when they had contacted this person, this realtor, to let him know that it wasn't a fee that I necessarily had to pay. He then reached back out to me and told me if I were to drop the claim, he would return my money. I said, I'm going to keep the claim. I also want my money back. He sent me the money, and then I received a letter from the realty group, I guess, that he's a part of, and they didn't know about, or they say they didn't know about this agreement. They say they had nothing to do with it. It was just him. But I was still upset about it, even if it was just, just this one person. So I posted about it in the Allston-Brighton Facebook group and found out that not only had he done this before to other people, there were also other realtors or other people charging a similar fee. In some cases, I heard that someone paid a whole month's rent for this fee, which was nuts to me. I'm still trying to figure out what that was, but regardless, it's ridiculous to have to pay money to stay in the same place that you're living in, especially when nothing's improving, nothing's changing. Our rent already goes up, I think like $50 a year, which thankfully isn't as much as I've heard other people's rent go up, but still it's really frustrating when, $100 that could feed you for a week or two, minus inflation, but still like that's considerable amount of money these days. And it ended up getting to a news person. They reached out to me, was able to cover it, and sharing that article led to a lot of other people realizing that, I don't have to pay everything that I'm told I have to pay. There, are certain things that are outside of that scope. And I think we're still trying to figure out what the deal is on realtor fees and where that lies in the scope of things. But yeah, that's where I am at now.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's definitely, I learned a lot when I saw that article. And I consider myself someone who knows a lot about tenants' rights. But it was really a remarkable thing to see because I've definitely paid application fees in the past. I don't know if by show of hands has anyone else ever paid an application fee. Um, Good for all of you if that's never been something that you've had to deal with, because it's definitely something that a lot of folks have had to deal with. Application fees, brokers fees, all these sorts of things. My renting experience, like I said, I am a renter. I've been in the same unit since 2017, which in Allston is, nothing short of an accomplishment, it feels like, just with how expensive everything is in the neighborhood. In general, my landlord, as I've said before, I would describe them as, not always the most attentive, but definitely not malicious. But we've dealt with a lot of issues in our apartment as well. In the middle of 2020, so at the height of the pandemic, my landlord did tell me that they wanted to raise my rent. The reason why they had said they wanted to raise my rent is because we live in a 3-bedroom apartment, and we had 4 people living in the unit, as we had since we moved in 2017. But they said that because we had 4 people living there instead of 3 people, they didn't need to raise the rent. I brought this up with my landlord to say that this has always been the situation, and there's no need to raise the rent in the middle of a pandemic, and they disagreed with me. So I actually CC'd in an email all of my city councilors and their staffers, and I said, if you would like to raise my rent, I'm going to need you to provide written documentation of why you're doing it to these people. At which point they said that they decided not to raise my rent, but they also told me that I can't just get what I want by CCing my city councilors, which, seems like it worked out in my favor. So it feels like, because of Serene's story and because of experiences that I've had as a renter and other folks that I know, it felt like there was a space that needed to be filled in terms of talking about what our rents are as renters. And so that's why we're recording this conversation for the people who can't be here tonight, that they can hopefully take some of the information that we'll be sharing and apply it to their own experiences. So we're going to spend just about 10 or so minutes going over some general information about renters' rights, and then I want to throw it over to you folks to talk about some renting experiences that you've had. And maybe we can, talk about what we need to do from a policy standpoint to help, prevent some of these situations from happening in the future. So with that, let me share my screen. There we go. All right. Also, apologies. I live on ComAv, right next to the Green Line. So if you hear a lot of noises, that's why. So first big question that I think is on our minds, especially after Serene's story, which is, what exactly do I have to pay when I'm signing a lease? So according to the Attorney General's office, the landlord really can only ask for the following payments to be made up front. So that's your first month's rent, a security deposit, which cannot be more than 1 month's rent, and your last month's rent as well, in addition to the cost of a new lock and key for the apartment. This is where things get a little bit tricky when it comes to things like broker's fees. So you are not legally required to pay a broker's fee. But the way that it works is, a broker is someone that is hired by the landlord to help advertise their apartment. So when you think about it, the broker's fee should be something that the landlord should cover the cost of. But in many instances, that cost is passed on to the tenant. Now, you are legally not allowed to charge a broker's fee if you are not a licensed broker. So the first thing that you should do if you get a broker's fee is you should ask if your broker is a licensed broker, because if not, you shouldn't have to pay that. I also wanted to throw it over to Lizzie real quick to talk about options through the housing court when it comes to broker's fees, if that's okay with you, Lizzie.
Yeah, absolutely. So something I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give everybody the website of how to find out if the real estate agent that you are working with is a licensed broker. That is a really quick way to make sure that you actually pay a real broker who has earned their licensure and everything else, because there's a lot of realtors who use them interchangeably, and that's not the case. It is something that I think we need to pressure the Greater Boston Real Estate Board to try to make sure that information is a lot more accessible, and also that it's a lot more clear, because I don't think the regular layperson goes into a real estate company and is asking whether or not somebody is a licensed to somebody who is simply a realtor or a real estate agent, when they come with different accesses, licensing skills, and also a different type of ethic boundary as well. Brokers have a tendency to have a lot more fair housing training and all of these other components that make them different from a regular real estate agent. So how you find that out is by looking at the licensee lookup. So a couple different options if you find yourself kind of in a place where you realize that you've either already paid a fee of some sort and you're in the apartment, or you haven't quite moved in yet. So make sure everything is written down and documented, no matter what you do as you go through your apartment search, because we're trying to catch you all before September. Make sure you document everything, make sure everything is in writing. So if you find out that you have paid a fee already, the first option you have is to reach out to the landlord and say, hey, I've noticed that I've paid this fee. According to, Massachusetts law, I was not required to pay this fee. And you have a couple different ways that you can do this. You can report it directly to the Attorney General office, as Serene did. Serene was very comfortable to do that, and that's totally fine. But let's say you're like, if I have a problem, I'm afraid of retaliation, I'm afraid of, all of these things. An option that you do have is that you can offer to say, can I remove this fee from my next month's rent? And that is a legal way that you can do that. That is a completely allowed way to do that. And document whether or not that answer is acceptable. Do not ask that over the phone. Try to make sure you ask that via email or ask that via text, so that we have all of that documentation in writing. And as soon as you get an answer to that, and a confirmation of that, you can still file something with the Attorney General's office later, because something that I do know the Attorney General's office is looking for is they are trying to look for documented cases of how often and how frequent this sort of issue is happening. They actually were testifying before the State House recently when it came to the Housing Committee that they have actually seen a huge increase in reports for it in the last 2 years. So we are not crazy. These fees are becoming a lot more common. And a large part of it is because of, I think, the concept of transience. And they rely on the fact that you don't know. So let's say you report it to the Attorney General, they're not going to budge on it. They're not going to look at it. The next step is that they report it both to the municipality, and the Attorney General's office will file it into housing court for you. If you are a protected class, so fair housing law has really specific protected classes that's based on race, that's based on family status, that's based on income. So if you're a Section 8 voucher holder, that's also a protected class. And in Boston specifically, it does not extend outside of Boston for this, but for any sort of sexual or gender identity specifically, that is considered a protected class violation. And if you fall into that category, they can also file a fair housing issue as well, if they feel that there is some sort of evidence that says that you were targeted in a specific way for those identifiers. So, and housing court sounds really scary, but it has been made to be a very simplified process, a lot more different than a civil court situation or criminal court situation. A lawyer is always helpful, but if you have somebody going through the Attorney General's office or through the city of Boston or another municipality, more than likely they will be able to assist you either with the legal process or just let you know what paperwork you need to file, because they usually have a tendency to do it in groups in some way, shape, or form. So there's a little bit more information sharing back and forth. And there are some cases in which it will take months for it to go through. So, don't expect that, like, one, if you get kicked out, that it's going to happen right away, or, any sort of issues like that. It's a long process. It's a lot of paperwork to go through. There are actually, a lot of housing cases right now, I think, between the pandemic lift on eviction holds, I think a lot of delays on how we are dealing with evictions currently post-pandemic and post, like, some of the lifts on the CDCs. And, now I think right now, after Serene's story has dropped, there's a lot more, I think, going in about, questions of just fees generally and like what is the due process afterwards. And also, I think the time limit is still like kind of a legally squishy question right now. So it can take anywhere between 6 to 8 months before you'll get an answer. And you cannot get charged as a tenant if you are not, if it's found that, like, it was illegal pay and there was nothing wrong with it, there is no charge against you for it. So, but if there is something, a charge against the landlord, they do actually have to recoup you back some money in addition to other monies for the time and space that it took in order to go through the housing court. So it's kind of a good win for tenants, which is why it's very many times in your favor to report it. Yeah. But again, there's still some questions, I think, about how safe we feel doing that in a housing crisis, which we will pass to Julia to talk about the housing crisis and the housing shortage and how that will work. So, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
No, I think that's perfect. And I think, as you had mentioned, like, documentation is incredibly important. We have a little page later on about like tips and tricks, and getting everything in writing is important. It's also important to read what has been presented to you. So my first tip of the evening is to read your lease. If you haven't read it before, read it now. Read it every time you renew your lease. You never know what might have changed between year to year. There are certain things that if you see it in your lease, it's possible that they're not legal. So things like if you find in your lease that it says that the tenant needs to pay for the cost of repairing ordinary wear and tear, that is not legal. That is the obligation of the landlord. If it says that you're not allowed to join a tenants union, you totally are. We were actually going to have some folks from the Feinberg Tenants Union here, but unfortunately they weren't able to make it. But joining a tenants union is a really great way to build collective power. And all these other things, really be sure to check your lease and make sure that what they're saying, meets the legal standards of the state. There are websites online that we'll be sharing as well after the fact, where you can double check these things just to make sure that your lease is legal. This is an important question that a lot of people wonder about, which is, when can my landlord legally enter my apartment? So your landlord is under obligation to give you what is generously called a reasonable amount of time before they are allowed to enter your home. There's no actual standard of time in terms of like hours or days that they have to give you an advance notice, but it's expected that they give you a reasonable amount of time. If you feel like your landlord is not giving you a reasonable amount of time, you should reach out to your local elected representatives, your attorney general's office, your Office of Housing Stability, just to make sure that they are addressing their ability to enter your apartment in a reasonable way. These are the following reasons why your landlord is legally allowed to enter your apartment. It's to inspect the premises, to make repairs, to show the apartment to prospective tenants, if there's a court order that they need to enforce, if the premises appear to be abandoned, and that's obviously like a little bit of a legal gray area, and obviously to inspect the premises within 30 days of tenancy. This is one other thing that we definitely wanted to uplift, which is the nature of your security deposit. Security deposit is something that you pay at the beginning just to ensure that there is money at the end of your lease to cover any repairs. I was brought up under the belief that a security deposit is lost money as soon as you give it to your landlord. And if you happen to get it back at the end of the lease, hey, that's an extra month's rent that you have in your pocket. But really, you are entitled to your security deposit at the end of your lease. The only reasons that your landlord is allowed to withhold your security deposit are for things like unpaid rent, repairs made as a result of damage caused by the tenant, not just regular wear and tear. That does include pet damage. When you submit a security deposit, your landlord is supposed to put that in a separate bank account, and you are entitled to collect interest on your security deposit as well. And another important tip is to document the condition of your apartment as soon as you move in. If at the end of your tenancy, your landlord says that there are things in the apartment that are faulty or damaged, that were damaged when you moved in, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are not the cause of that damage and that was there originally. So it's very important not just to have written documentation, but also visual documentation of the condition of your apartment. If you're late on your rent, life happens. These are things that go on. I've definitely been late on my rent before, and I'm not afraid to say that on a recorded channel. Your landlord may attempt to evict you if you've not been paying your rent. When you are late on your rent, your landlord may submit to you what's called a notice to quit. A notice to quit, and this is very important, is not the same thing as an eviction. And I'm going to say that again because it's very important. A notice to quit is not an eviction. What a notice to quit means is when you receive a notice to quit, it means, in Massachusetts at least, it means that you have 14 days to settle any unpaid rent plus interest in order to avoid an eviction. It's also very important to note that only a judge can grant an eviction. So if your landlord is coming in and saying you haven't paid your rent, you need to get out, I'm evicting you, that's not how it works. There is a legal process, and you do have rights in the eviction process, even if you have not been paying your rent on time. So you will be placed through, the housing court system. As Lizzie said, it is not as scary of a process as you may think it is. There will be an opportunity for you while you're going through the housing court system to make any complaints about the landlord, or if there have been conditions that you feel may justify you having withheld the rent for any particular reason, you'll have the option there. A quick note on the 14-day notice to quit. I personally, and this is my own opinion, I don't think 14 days is enough time. I couldn't build together enough money in my current paycheck to pay my rent fully in 14 days. I need more than that in the month to pay that. So I would personally like to see the 14-day notice to quit extended to be a little bit more longer, just because I feel like most people, especially if you're getting paid bi-weekly, odds are you're not able to come up with that money in such a short amount of time. That's just my own opinion on this. Speaking of which, I want to talk about withholding your rent. You are entitled to withhold a portion of your rent if there are unfixed repairs that need to get made in your apartment. But the only way that you can legally withhold your rent is you need to have appealed to your landlord to make the repairs. You need to have contacted the local board of health and make sure that they have inspected your apartment. And you also do need to be up to date on your rent. If you have gone all through that and you're not paying your rent and your landlord still hasn't made the repairs, you are also entitled to contract out those repairs separately and deduct that from your rent. But once again, save your receipts, save all your documentation, and making sure that you're being responsible about that. If you go through all the...
Can I interject on one thing? If you withhold your rent, the other one too is that you do have to hold it in an escrow account. That is a requirement. You have to demonstrate that the money does exist. So you can't just withhold it and then spend it on something else if you need to in any way. It is a requirement usually by housing court that you have to demonstrate that the money exists somewhere in an interest-bearing account. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And then I actually really wanted to quickly go back to the notice to quit because I know Julia had mentioned, some personal experiences with that process. And I was wondering, Julie, if you'd be willing to talk on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds really similar actually to Sarah's experience that Sarah just shared in the chat. I had a bad winter last winter, and I just forgot to pay my rent in December, and didn't I have a partner and a roommate, so there's three of us, and they paid their rent. I just forgot, and I was really shocked a couple weeks later to find, like, wake up in the morning and they just kind of slide the notice to quit under your door. And it's a very jarring experience. I had never received one of those before, and I thought I was being evicted. So obviously, really freaked out. But luckily, there are resources online that, let you know some of this information. And I managed to settle up, and it was all okay. But I do think that it's a very flawed system that allows them to send you a notice to quit and not really explain what it is, and not give you kind of like ample notice that, like, hey, you forgot to pay your rent this month. So
Yeah.
that's my experience.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, like, life happens. I think as a renter, there's a lot of leeway that we extend to our landlords to make sure that things are done in a reasonable time. And it's also important that that is, done to us as well. This is one of the things I'm actually, like, somewhat pleased with my landlords about is they still require, like, a paper check. And they're not checking the mailbox at the very first of the month. So, like, they're pretty reasonable about, like, the rent getting paid and everything like that. So, like, that is something that I think is somewhat unique to my experiences, especially if you're paying online and there's like a physical documentation of when you are having to submit your rent. It's important to pay your rent on time. I can say that without it, feeling controversial. So yeah, so we talked about withholding your rent. I also want to talk about rent increases. So you may have seen recently some news that the city council and the mayor approved a home rule petition to re-implement rent control within the city of Boston. That has not become law yet. The way that the home rule petition process works is that even though it's passed in the city and the mayor has signed it, the state house still needs to approve it, and that's a very difficult legislative beast in and of itself. So at the current moment, at the end of your lease, if your landlord wants to raise your rent, they are entitled to raise it as much as possible. However, it's really important that if you in the past have had issues with your landlord and you have contacted the Board of Health, or you've tried to join a tenants organization, or you have other legal rights, and you feel like your landlord is retaliating against you for any of those things, you do have options to fight up against any form of retaliation, which includes rent increases in an attempt to push you out of the unit. So it's very important to know that you do have rights. It's also important to know that most leases do not allow for the landlord to increase the rent mid-lease, but there are some exceptions to that. So please read your lease because you'll never know what you're going to see in there. And when you sign a lease, it is binding unless there are some really egregious things going on in there. Lastly, just a couple of other tips and tricks. Like I said, document everything, making sure that if you're having a conversation with your landlord in person and they're making a promise to you, you need to get that in writing, either email or text or anything like that. Take pictures of the place when you move in and when you move out to make sure that you're documenting the wear and tear that occurs naturally over the time of your tenancy. Like I said, I've been in this unit since 2017, and the building is older because of the wear and tear that goes on. And then lastly, negotiation is an option. When you're re-signing your lease and your landlord wants to raise your rent, you are within your rights to negotiate with them and say, hey, I would like to continue living here. I like living here. Can we talk about maybe not raising the rent, or can we do something different instead? So, like, you always have the option to negotiate. And then quickly before we close with the presentation portion, I just wanted to throw it over again to Julia really quick to talk a little bit about, how we see the relationship between tenants' rights and, like, the creation of new affordable housing. Julia works for an organization called Abundant Housing Massachusetts, which is one of the leading progressive pro-housing organizations in the state. So I just wanted to give a moment to Julia to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacob. So I live in Brighton, but I also do work for Abundant Housing Massachusetts, which is a statewide pro-housing organization. And what that means is that mostly our little corner of the housing crisis that we focus on is the fact that we're not building enough homes in Massachusetts especially, but all over the country as well, to keep pace with the demand for people who want to live here. So we think that there are many things needed in order to solve the housing crisis, like I'm sure some of you have heard of the 3 S's. We need supply, supply of new homes, stability, like rent stabilization and all these tenant protections that we've spoken about, and subsidy. So that's inclusionary zoning, things like also Section 8 vouchers, things like that. So we do focus on building more homes at Abundant Housing Massachusetts. And although we're not a tenant organizing group, and there are many awesome tenant organizing groups in Boston, we do believe that advocating for more homes to be built around Boston and Massachusetts will help empower and protect tenants. Because the reality is we don't have enough homes in Boston or across Massachusetts, and that just creates more power for landlords to set market prices as high as they want. And in fact, even last week, there was an article in the Globe, which I'm happy to put in the chat, about it's titled "In Boston's Brutal Rental Market, the Final Insult Has Arrived: Bidding Wars." So now not only are there bidding wars for people looking to buy homes, but there are bidding wars for rentals as well. And the lack of supply of rental homes means that these wealthier renters who end up competing with middle income or working class renters are always going to win these units. And there's also a lot of confusion, I think, around vacancy rates and, whether it's good or bad to have a low vacancy rate. We have around a 2 to 3% vacancy rate in Boston in recent years. And some people come to the conclusion that having a 2 to 3% vacancy rate means there's plenty of supply left that we could open to low income or people experiencing homelessness. But actually having a very low vacancy rate feeds into the power of landlords because, we do live in a society where like land is privately owned and they're able to set, keep that rent as high as they want. So we think a more healthy vacancy rate would be, somewhere around like 8-10%. And then we would have enough supply that the landlords would not be able to hold all of that power. So yeah, we think that what we do at Abundant Housing Massachusetts contributes to tenant protections, and that we would be lessening the power of individual landlords who kind of hold all the keys when there's a supply deficit. And I'm happy to take any questions about that as well.
Thank you so much, Julia. So that is pretty much the end of all of the information sharing portion of this conversation. I did want to take an opportunity to throw it over to the folks who have very kindly taken time out of their Friday to be with us. If they have stories that they'd like to share or questions that they have about renting, like I mentioned, part of the goal of this is, as a candidate, I want to find ways to strengthen tenant protections so that the struggles that we're currently experiencing can hopefully be ameliorated in the future. So I know, Sarah, you've had quite the interesting year in your building. Would you care to tell us about that a little bit?
Oh, that's even pretty tame compared to some of my renting stories, honestly. But this year, the elevator was out for 5 weeks. And I live on the 5th floor. And I asked about reasonable accommodations, and they said no. And then they sent the lease renewal, and they raised my rent while the elevator was still broken. But yeah, no, that's pretty tame compared to some of the other things I've dealt with. My second apartment on Ashford Street in the Gap. They kept our entire security deposit and asked for $600 more for things like missing outlet covers, as if we would take the outlet covers. No one steals outlet covers. That's such a bizarre thing to charge for. But at the time I didn't know. So I did not fight for my security deposit. However, I did not pay them. We didn't give them the extra $600. We were like, yeah, no, that's not happening.
Was this an Alpha building?
This was Red Tree Real Estate.
Got it. I ask because one thing
I've also rented from Alpha.
I know you have. And I bring that up just because Especially in a neighborhood like Allston-Brighton, where there is a very large supply number of rental units, not in terms of availability, but just overall, we're a majority renter neighborhood. There are a number of landlords who have bought up a large number of properties, and in addition to what Julia's talking about, a supply, but the number of people who own these buildings is also like a very small number, and that gives them a tremendous amount of power. And so we've dealt with a lot of complaints from different landlord companies like Alpha Management.
Same,
Yeah, and
Feinstein or Feinberg.
Feinberg as well. Yeah, so there is a Feinberg's tenant union. I believe there is an Alpha Tenants Union
There
that has
is.
been
I
launched
don't
as well.
know how active it's been lately, though. I haven't heard anything from it for a while.
It's been tough, and they own a large number of buildings in the neighborhood, and it makes it very hard. One thing that we've seen is, they've tried to buy up new buildings in the neighborhood. I know Alpha has been trying to buy up a building on Gardner Street, which has been met with a lot of opposition.
Yes, I led that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would love to see, what options there are from a legal standpoint to, if there are developers or there are landlords who have a very long history of not respecting their tenants, what options do we have in place to, instead of allowing them to purchase a property, how can we ensure that there's opportunities for co-op living or other means to make sure that we are not giving out more and more property?
I mean, I think the first step in that is to increase the fines on violations, because they say, oh, $500, doesn't matter.
I think also too, another part of the Alpha piece. So I also lived in Alpha Realty housing, but it's not documented that I've ever lived in Alpha Realty housing because Northeastern University leases with them. And so something that people didn't know is that on St. Stephen Street, there are what they call lease properties for upperclassmen that are advertised to Northeastern students as one, more cost effective because they are older and they don't really tell you that, but two, that it has more communal accessible kitchenware and everything, so that if you couldn't afford to have like a meal plan in the dorms, which was a requirement of the dorms, lease properties allowed you to, bail out of that so that you could buy your own groceries on your own price and on your own dime, which, there's lots of other problematic ideas there, but I was an unlucky tenant in one of those particular dorms, and I had rats that crawled over my covers every single night.
No.
And I actually had just started my co-op with the city of Boston when I was living here, when I found out from somebody in inspectional services that that was not okay, that I did not have to live like that. That they were like, just because you're a student, it doesn't mean you have to live like that. And I remember trying to report it, and he said, but just make sure you report it to Northeastern first, so that goodwill was given to report it to them. Northeastern actually said to me, well, we're not in charge of these dorms. I know you paid us to live in these dorms, but we are not in charge of them. So you have to reach out to Alpha Realty in order to get this resolved. And only because so there was 2 weeks that I waited for that answer from Northeastern to then get bounced over to ask Alpha Realty, who then I have to technically wait 30 days, legally speaking, in order to figure out whether or not they either have a response or have a plan in order to get rid of those rats. So we're talking 6 weeks that I had to wait before I could even say something to the city of Boston about the conditions of that particular dorm. And they do not pay property taxes in this city, and they are often, Northeastern has had more than enough money, financing, time, and donorship to, expand on land to buy up dorms, let alone, making sure that maybe that all of their dorms are up to code, up to date and everything. And at no point did they take responsibility for that. And they have students who are enrolled in undergraduate studies who still live there now and have indicated to me that those conditions have not changed. But it's mostly students who don't know that they can reach out to the city of Boston as a student. A lot of students do not think that they have rights in the city of Boston, but they do. So I would love to make sure that we also reach out to students to let them know that they still have tenant rights, even though they're not permanent residents to some. So
and there are legal habitability standards. Your landlord is legally obligated to ensure that you have a habitable environment, and so that means free from pests. You have heat in the winter. My first apartment, when I was living in Dorchester, my first year in Boston, we didn't have winter heat in the middle of February. And I just figured well, I got to put on an extra blanket because I didn't know my rights. So yeah, those are the sorts of things that you really do need to pay attention to. Justin, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had a question. First, I wanted to just, this is so educational, and big thanks to you, Jacob, and also Lizzie and Serene and Julia for presenting and talking about your experiences and your expertise. I mean, you know, the more that I hear about and experience, I'm a renter. I live in Aberdeen, just up the street from Cleveland Circle, and you know, it seems like there are so many parts of this system that are stacked against renters, and that the system seems to be best equipped to squeeze as much money as possible out of these properties. And so, you know, just as a candidate, Jacob, I think it should be hugely important to everybody in our community how essential it is to have somebody in office representing constituents who has the lived experience of a renter. I think that, you know, that's that qualifies you as an outstanding candidate, and amongst many other qualities. But here's my question. So, you know, I live in a mid-rise building with about 28 units, 30% owner occupied, the rest are condos. And so we have sort of small landlords, relatively small landlords, meaning like, I think my landlord has like 6 or 7 other properties scattered throughout the city. And what I've noticed over time is like, you know, he's fairly timely, but when it comes to fixing things, it is the bare minimum. You know, and I'm thinking that these buildings, you know, it's a big, beautiful building. It's 100 years old, however. And so nobody is looking at sort of the large scale needs of these kinds of buildings, and because we all live in these units. And I'm thinking about specifically about adapting to climate change and the way that these buildings, like all buildings that have tend to have large greenhouse gas, you know, emission footprints. And as they can possibly adapt to that, I wanted to hear if there are any ways that renters, because it seems like the owners in my building are absolutely clueless about any of that. Like, you know, they will probably buy another oil powered furnace when this one conks out for the basement. It's like, what's the path forward for making sure that tenants have a voice in that kind of transition, as we think about, you know, the majority of our buildings in Allston-Brighton are large, they're old, and they have pretty big greenhouse gas emission footprints. And so what's the pathway towards like empowering, you know, tenants to make sure that any improvements, big improvements to infrastructure isn't passed down to them?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. In terms of, especially when we're talking about retrofitting a lot of our older homes to be a lot more climate resilient, I know the mayor did announce recently a green energy retrofit program. So I definitely, because as they said about 1,000 times during the press conference, buildings are responsible for around 70% of Boston's greenhouse gases. I hope I'm quoting that correctly. And so it's a major factor in Boston's climate resilience plan to retrofit a lot of our older buildings. I live in an older building that, yeah, like the heat emission from our gas heat is just so palpable. And so in terms of like how to get more involved in that process, as I definitely continue to follow along with the green energy retrofitting program, I'm hoping that there'll be opportunities for more tenants to get involved and offer their support for that. I also highly recommend collective action is a really, really important way to ensure that tenants have greater rights. So I would consider talking to your neighbors more about, you know, what they're going through. And if you find that you're all sort of on the same page about the, you know, the way in which your building needs to be retrofitted and upgraded to be more sustainable for the future, you know, there's always strength in numbers. And those are two things that I would like to see done. In terms of as like a candidate and what I would like to see done on a systemic level, I think the number one thing that we need to look at is how we're funding inspectional services. The folks at inspectional services do a lot of great work, but they are so understaffed to the point where, like, if you got a new restaurant, for example, that's opening up in the neighborhood, good luck. You'll get maybe an ISD person there in a couple months. So it's like it really delays the process of getting satisfaction, particularly as a tenant. Like ISD does have the capacity to conduct surprise inspections on properties, but their capacity to do that is limited by the fact that they just don't have that many staff. So one thing I would really like to see done is the city council, because we have these new budgetary powers, they need to really, really invest in inspectional services to make sure that they have the staff on hand to make sure that like all these faulty properties, especially the ones in Allston-Brighton, and because of our large population of college students that kind of come and go, making sure that we get a lot of attention in that space as well is really, really important. I hope that answers your question. Hey, all right. Does anyone else have any like shocking renting experiences that they would like to tell me, or other sorts of things that they think would be helpful when it comes to designing tenant strengthening policies?
I mean, I put my horror story in the chat just now.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, so Sarah, I will definitely go to you in a sec, but I want to say hi to Jacqueline. And Jacqueline, if you have anything you want to share.
Hey, yes. I don't want to cut off this young lady, but I do have some exciting stuff to share that I discovered out of this law book that I picked up from someone in the neighborhood.
Hey, all right.
So after you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Sarah, do you want to go first and then we'll go to Jacqueline?
Where'd she go?
Sure. So I'll just kind of read what I wrote in the chat. But my worst tenant experience was I lived in Somerville for a year in, I want to say 2017-ish. And our landlord tried to charge us each $250 to move out, and move out fees are not a legal charge. And so we replied and we're like, no, you can't do that. And he said, okay, well, I'll waive the fee, but you can't move out until September 7th because the elevators are reserved. And our lease ended on August 31st. We're like, well, okay, we're just gonna move out with the stairs then.
Yeah. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Plus, no one was even using the elevators. We used them anyway. But gets worse because as we are literally moving out, we get a rap on the door, and it's two Somerville police officers. And they said, yeah, we're here to serve an eviction note. We were called and said that you've been evicted and you're refusing to move out or something.
Talk about fuckery. Oh my God. So he's trying to blackmail you to stay an extra week when you want to leave, and then
I have no idea.
Wow.
We're like, well, if first of all, we have not been served an eviction notice, and we know that, you know, that's a 30-day sort of deal. And second of all, we're literally moving out. So if we were evicted, like, seems like a non-issue at this point.
These people really have no lives and no time on their hands. And I don't like, life can't be that boring. Is he that fat that he like can't fit through his like door, that he has nothing else to do in life other than to fuck with young people like this?
I mean, he also founded a like hate group, the landlord. So
I mean, Sarah, you just have the worst luck with these renting.
This is awful.
I'm doing okay for now. I mean, the elevator was a whole thing, but other than that, this apartment's pretty good.
I do like your building a lot, actually. I like that whole neighborhood. So all right, so Jacqueline, you said you got a housing book recently?
Yeah, so I found this like maybe 2 weeks ago. And I have since we have spoken contacted. I found it seems kind of like a Ticket Cricket version of like a housing authority lawyer place, but I still I have yet to speak with someone over the phone. But they have a really cool they're called Cape. If anybody wants to look them up when I find the link. I don't know, are we going to be doing this on like a monthly basis kind of thing, so we can meet up and like share our ridiculous housing stories and
to be determined, but that's not a bad idea.
Okay. So keeping that in mind, but I'll send that out to everyone so that they can use it for they have something simple where it's like if someone's not giving you your security deposit back, kind of like a quick cut and dry sort of thing. I'm having a similar just different outrageous issue with my landlords. Really, it's a company that has several buildings similar to the gentleman that spoke earlier. They have properties all over Boston, and some of them have landlords and property managers, and some of them, like the one I'm in now, doesn't. So like when you call 311, the first thing they do is ask for your landlord's name and number, right? So they have to be able to supply that. So I'm pretty sure they've been trying to figure out how to like weasel in between what they legally do and don't have to do, or what they have to have on paper, or what do they actually have to have. But what she sounded like she's dealing with, and what I'm currently dealing with, is retaliatory eviction, which is illegal. So this is, I spoke with someone else today on Newberry Street, who said that they have issues like this with, on commercial levels also. So I think just more and more tenants, the more people, like you're saying, the more of us that know our rights, the more that we can bother them enough to actually bring it to court, to make it waste their time, not our time and our stress and our money. We want to make it, my goal, I don't know about you, but I want to make this as big of a problem as possible for as many landlords as possible, for them to say it's not an issue. Like I want them to start selling or giving the properties back to the bank, putting the liens on it. That'll make it cheaper for the house to be bought by someone else who actually does want to put the work into it, bring it up to code, take care of people. So when people are like, oh, it's going to get caught up for years in court process, good. So what it says here, this is a CMR exam. I don't know exactly what CMR is yet, but under this, so this law book, whoever this law student was, they had everything, like, I don't know if you guys can see like the colors of all the little tabs that they have for all the types of law. So this is under real estate. And the two different things, I'll read it to you here. It says retaliatory eviction. In many states, a landlord may not terminate a lease or otherwise penalize a tenant in retaliation for the tenant's exercise of her legal rights, including reporting housing or building code violations. So for me, that was my gas, our heating was broken for more than 2/3 of the winter. And they brought, at first, they gave us a small, well, I was here by myself at the beginning of it. So they gave me a small heater that lasted maybe like a week and a half, and then it died. I asked them if it was crap. Now, not for nothing, but I didn't realize how cheap it is to go out and get a room heater. But they can't, this is not about, well, survival, but now we're stuck in the, like, I don't want to pay the heating bill, and they don't want to have to pay to fix it. But they have been charging me upwards of like $300 to $500 every month since that, and blaming it on a very generic, they can't blame it purely on utilities because they have a third party. But what they have been doing is basically charging me for like 2 or 3 rooms worth. At one point, they were charging me for almost the entire house, and this is an 11-room house. I'm renting 1 room. So $400 to $500 worth, and just saying that there was damages. The most of the damages that I have, I would like to have a lot of people over, have everyone over for like a get together at some point, which I keep saying I'm gonna do, and that's just my own anxiety. So I apologize for that. One of these days, hopefully I can get something together and we can like all come over and have tea and pizza and like listen to music or watch a movie on a projector on one of the walls. But $500 is a lot of money every month on top of an $1,100 room. So like this month I paid, they were trying to charge me $1,800 on top of the $700 that I already paid. So now my bank account is in the negative $700. That reminds me, that was on my to-do list today, is I need to go print out that bank statement to show you already have 2/3 of my month's rent. So for you to ask for another $1,800, I should only be giving you $400 for the rent. And then all of the other statements that I have of them charging all these other things. And it says in here that they have to be able to show specifically what the damages are, because $200 is not enough damage to say, like I have to paint. I had put some stuff up on my wall, which can easily be fixed with some white paint. 1 coat of white paint is not $200 worth of damage. So these are the other things. Example, many statutes presume a retaliatory motive if the landlord acts within, example, 90 to 180 days after the tenant exercises their rights. They started charging me for all of this extra random mystery stuff within a month or two. 180 days, they would have had to wait like 3 to 6 months. So to overcome the presumption, the landlord must show a valid, non-retaliatory reason for his actions. Meaning there has to be a legitimate reason for several $100s worth of damages, not you hung a picture on the wall.
Yeah, I think that's pretty wild. It did remind me of another resource that I wanted to share with people, which is definitely whenever you feel like there's an instance where you're not comfortable or you're not sure with what's going on with your landlord and you need to get some information or you need to get some resources, the Attorney General's office is a great place to go. But even on the city level, we have an Office of Housing Stability, and they're really helpful. They're more or less like case managers who look at a lot of people's individual housing concerns. So I always highly recommend, if you ever have an interaction with your landlord that you're not entirely sure about, or you're getting charged for something you're not sure about, they're a really great resource to go to. They're also helpful for some interesting circumstances that don't come up a lot, because there's a lot of like landlord tenant conversations that we've been having. There are some interesting instances of like tenant problems where, like, if you're on a lease with 2 other people and one of those people doesn't pay their rent on time, sorry Julie, I'm not calling you out, but what happens if you have someone who like leaves out on their lease halfway through your tenancy there and stuff like that. The Office of Housing Stability is a really great place to go if you ever have sort of questions about those sorts of things. They help to resolve a lot of issues. Like ISD, they are extremely understaffed, and I would like to see them get more staffing on site, just because they work incredibly hard. So I wanted to offer that to you, Jacqueline, to definitely encourage you to reach out to them in regards to this. But just as a general note to everyone, that Office of Housing Stability is a really good group of people who are very passionate about tenants' rights and making sure that our tenants are being looked after as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those. Do you have maybe before we get off the call, can I ask you for those phone numbers? Are those like easily Googleable?
Yeah, I just put it in the chat. So if you go to their website, their number's up there. They also have their email that they answer. In my experience, they're really good about getting back to people and everything. So I highly recommend that. But yeah, we are coming up to about an hour, and I wanted to see if anyone else had any thoughts, questions, concerns about housing. Anyone has any good stories, maybe a good positive interaction that they had at some point.
I'll share a positive story.
Yeah.
Yeah. This year, we got our rent raised by about 10% when we received our new lease, and it's more than our landlords had ever raised our rent. So we got involved with the Boston Tenants Union. They were sending a letter around to our landlord, and so we took the letter and did some canvassing. I live in like a kind of like a courtyard of a lot of different smaller like 4-story buildings, and had a lot of really great conversations. Ended up delivering a letter to the landlord, but also from the advice that we got from fellow tenants, and we had a lot of great conversations, we're able to negotiate the rent down a little bit. Still being a lot, but I do think that's a success story.
Awesome. That's great. It's good to have success stories. And yeah, as I had mentioned, unfortunately, my landlord has increased my rent since, but the first time they tried to raise my rent, I did contact my city councilors and I said, this is unacceptable. And they ended up not raising my rent. So like when you do speak up and you do like collectively like work with your neighbors and your fellow tenants and everything, you are totally able to achieve successful results. Justin, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I was just gonna I love living in a building. I love having neighbors, and I know I imagine a lot of the renters in Allston-Brighton are probably in large mid-rise buildings. But we've had side yard socials, like we call them, or just like opportunities to like meet your neighbors. It's incredibly difficult to organize and reach a lot of these tenants and a lot of these renters. Just gaining access to buildings, like if you're canvassing or getting people to sign something, it's very, very difficult. So in buildings, you can have like very, very simple social events, and it's a great opportunity. And I really love that. And I think it's a great organizing opportunity to sort of get to know your neighbors. And it doesn't have to be about like, yelling at or griping about your landlord that might come up, of course, but like just simply getting to them and building that kind of community, because these are people who, you know, are the first people you go to sometimes in emergencies, and they're really, they can play in a really important role in your life. So, so this isn't like a, you know, a tenant landlord thing, but really helping grow that like collective power by creating communities is really fun.
That's awesome. I love that. I wish that there was more space in my building to hold like community little spaces like that. Maybe the laundry room. I'll have to figure that out. Thank you for sharing. Sarah, and then we'll conclude with Lizzie before we head out.
Well, you can just take over the Eversource lot next to your space first of all. No, but another issue that could be addressed at the city council level is expanding services for renters. For example, the composting pilot didn't include buildings with so many units. Same with the mattress recycling program. Like someone recently posted in the Allston-Brighton community Facebook group that they were gonna have to pay $150 to get rid of their mattress because they were in a building that was too big to get the free service. So just an idea.
I don't understand that. Is that not like 95% of the entire neighborhood?
Yeah.
That's actually so how I want to conclude this actually, it's interesting that you say that because I was just thinking about how, you know, as Sarah mentions, like the cost to be a renter is so expensive. Because we do not have the privilege of having access to things like composting services that are door to door, mattress recycling that is door to door, that we are treated as almost secondary as far as like, especially if you live in a big building and it's like a very punishable sort of effect if you live here, despite the fact that one, living in a denser building is healthier for the city. It's often a lot more cost effective for most people. And honestly, like helps bring communities together. And I think it's wild that we like don't have like some sort of system that includes them as part of being a Boston citizen. It's a very exclusive system that we have created. And I am not going to say it's on purpose, but it does feel like it has been accidentally neglected for quite some time, that it has created some systemic issues for folks like Serene, for example, who thankfully is smart enough and witty enough to like, you know better and to look up and be curious. But some of us do not have the capacity to be curious, and some of us do not have the you know, resources to be curious. And we should not be punished for that. I also just want a last minute plug. I'm also part of a group called Boston Artist Impact. Serene is also one of our budget gurus who works on Boston Artist Impact, showing us where money does and does not go in the city of Boston for the perspective of renters. And you can find us on Instagram. We are at Boston Artist Impact. And you can follow us. We do primarily resources for artists across the city for like nightlife stuff and everything else. But we did start as a housing group for artists specifically who were struggling to stay in their apartments. We have partnered with Abundant Housing many times to talk about things from a creative perspective, and as far as the perspective from Allston residents about why building more housing is helpful for us. And if you want Serene's perspective, she will yell at you about the budget stuff because she literally knows everything. So, and all sorts of great takes about the city council. And we post those as well. So follow us. We would love to have a chat with you about that kind of stuff. So.
Thank you so much, Lizzie, and thank you to all of you for taking time out of your evenings to come talk about housing. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. Renters' rights and creating more access to affordable housing is the most central part of my campaign because we can't afford to not live here anymore. And the people who are getting displaced the most are the ones who make this neighborhood the most special. So thank you again. We'll be following up with a recording. This will be shared, likely posted on YouTube. So thank you again for all of your time and everything. If you have any beef about that, definitely let me know. I'm going to stop recording now.